In the previous examples that we looked at when we were creating charts, we already had a table of data to take the chart from. But in this video, I want to show you if your table isn't suitable to create a chart, you can use something called a pivot chart instead. And the idea is that you take this entire table of data, let's say this large list of cake sales, you summarize it into a table and you create a chart at the same time. Now, there's a few little caveats that you ought to know. First of all, it's important that your columns have unique headings along the top here. It's really helpful if your data doesn't have any blank rows or any blank columns in it. If you need to calculate on things like dates, it's important that Excel thinks your dates are dates. Sometimes the way people type dates in, Excel doesn't really understand. It's easy to check. When you click on a date, can you see on the General tab up here, you have a little drop down that says date. So I can understand that Excel knows that my dates are actually dates. And the other thing that's quite crucial is that you have to be very accurate with your spelling. If you want to group together by client, for example, you'd have to make sure that every time that client is mentioned, that the text is identical. Now, there's lots of ways of cleaning data if you've got errors like that, which I will come to at some other juncture. But at the moment, we'll just make the assumption that your data is all beautifully neat and all your clients have been typed exactly identically. So all I need to do really is make sure that my cursor is inside the body of the data. So long as there's no blank rows or blank columns, Excel should decide how big the data set is automatically. However, what I can do to make sure that it understands the size and scope of my table is format it as a table. And it's got lots of other advantages when you're doing pivot tables as well. On your home tab, can you see there's a format as table option? It's got lots of different designs. It doesn't really matter which design you choose. It's the fact that it knows that it's a table is important. Can you see it's picked up the range automatically? Because I didn't have any blank rows or blank columns, it basically keeps going until it finds the first blank column. And if I scroll down a bit, you'll see that I've actually got 100 rows worth of data and it's selected until it finds the first blank row. So if for some reason you had blank rows or blank columns, if you can get rid of them, that's helpful. It's also automatically ticked this little box that says my table has headers, which my table does have headers. And then when I say OK to that, you should see it's applied whatever colour style to my table. And if you don't like the one that it's chosen, can you see it's come up with these different alternative designs here? So you can just mooch through until you find something that you like the look of. I'm going to go for probably a very plain one. Let's go for this one. It's not too distracting. Now, the other thing that I would do at this point is I would give the table a name, because you might want to refer to it in different formula and so on. And when you come to look at this in the future, you'll know what it is. So can you see it's just named it table 1 at the moment? And I'm just going to call it cake sales. You're not going to be allowed to use a space, so I've just run cake sales all into one word. And when I press enter, I've renamed that table. Now, when I go to create my pivot table, it will know to look for a table called cake sales. So I'm just going to start anywhere in the middle of my data. It doesn't really matter where it is. And on the insert tab, you know, when we were looking at the charts last time, we looked at the charts in this area here. Just to the right of that, there's something called a pivot chart, and that's what I'm after. And there's a choice of pivot chart or pivot chart and pivot table. I'm going for pivot chart and pivot table. And it's saying select the table or range. Now, normally that would pick up A1 to D47 or whatever it happens to be. But because we called it cake sales, it's picked up the name of the table automatically, which is sensible. You can have it on an existing worksheet because you can have more than one pivot table on a sheet at the same time. But for our example, we'll use new worksheet. And then when I choose OK, this is where my pivot table is going to grow, and this is where my pivot chart is going to be. And can you see on the right hand side here, it's come up with this pivot chart fields list. Now, normally, I have to say, this comes up automatically, but if for some reason you've switched it off, or whoever used the machine previously has switched it off, it's this field list button here that will switch it back on again. And you've got all of your headings from your columns appearing as fields in this top list. Which is why I suggest that you have nice unique names that you're going to recognise easily, because you don't have to go back to the sheet to work out what's in column A or whatever. You know that it's the product name. And then at the bottom here, you've got 4 little sections that potentially you can fill in. If you are clicked onto the pivot table part, they'll be called rows and columns. If you're clicked onto the pivot chart part, they'll be called axis and legend. But essentially, they do the same thing. It just depends whether you're on the chart bit or the table bit. I'll tell you what I'll do is I'll start with the table and you'll see how it works. So let's say I drag the product field into the row area. Can you see I've got row labels for each type of cake? And then maybe I want to know, well, how many of each type of cake have I sold? So I'm going to pop quantity, just literally drag and drop it into the values area. Now, because it's a number, Excel has automatically calculated it as a sum. If it was something that was text, it would use a function called count, where it just counts how many rows you've got. But because it's a number, it thinks, oh, presumably you want to add it up, which is probably quite sensible. And if you have a look at the totals, it's saying carrot cake, you sold 305 carrot cakes. And if I hover over my carrot cake column, you can see the chart is giving me exactly the same information. If you don't want a sum, if you choose this little drop down arrow, there is an option called value field settings where you can go in and you can set it to average or max, which will give you the highest value or whatever. But for the moment, we'll leave it set to sum of quantity. Now, you can also have a heading on the columns area, which again is usually something that is probably text. So let's say client. I'm going to pop client in the columns area, and can you see it's split it up? I've got 3 different carrot cake columns now because I've got 3 different clients: Baked Good, Cakes, and Jameson Bakery, and then I've got that 305 total overall. So you can have it in rows and columns just like you would in a normal table, but there's nothing to stop you actually having 2 things in rows or 2 things in columns. So if I move that client field, and I'm just going to drag and drop him just above the product field in the rows area, and can you see then I've got a total for Baked Goods Limited, and then it's broken it down by types of cake, total for cakes, and then it's broken it down by types of cake. And actually I could swap them round. If I had the product first and then the client, it gives me a total for carrot cake, and then it breaks it down by who I've sold it to. And can you see the same thing is happening to my chart? If I make my chart much bigger, just drag its little corner to give it a bit more space to play with, and you'll see it's grouped it together by carrot cake sales and then said, oh, this is how much is sold by each customer. And that is about as difficult as it is to make a pivot chart. One little caveat though is about how the charts refresh. I know when we were doing charts previously, you just typed the new figure in and then it automatically updated your chart. That's not quite true with pivot tables and pivot charts. Let's have a look at carrot cake. At the moment, we've got a total of 305 sales. I can't type in top of this value because it's a calculation based on the cake sales tab at the bottom. So I'm going to go back to the cake sales tab and try and find an order for carrot cakes. Let's say this one. Let's say, oh, that wasn't 10 items, that was 100 items. If I update it here, when I go back to my sheet, can you see it's made literally no difference at all because you have to refresh any changes that you've made. So can you see at the top here, I've got 2 little tabs, one called Pivot Table Analyze and one called Design. And I'm going to go to one called Pivot Table Analyze, or Pivot Chart Analyze if you have to be on the chart. And then I'm going to go refresh. And can you see, because carrot cake now is the much higher seller than anyone else, it's updated my chart and it's also updated my pivot table. And if I were to change that back again to what it was before, let's say it was 10 before, wasn't it? Again, I'd have to remember to go back to the Pivot Table Analyze tab, hit refresh, and then it will refresh my table. Because we set up the Format as Table option, you can now add extra items onto the end of the list. Let's say you've had a new order, let's say for cheesecake. let's say I've ordered another 100 cheesecakes or something, and they were £5, and it's from Baked Goods Limited, and I'll give it today's date. Can you see how the table is growing? So that's another advantage to this format as table option, is that it includes it as part of the table when you add extra records. If we hadn't done that stage, we'd have to update the pivot table to make sure it's looking at the correct range. But this time it hasn't updated yet, but when we hit refresh, it should pick up that Baked Good Limited order that we've just placed, and it's updated it on my chart automatically.